This land has always had its powerful beauty. For the people who homesteaded and built ranches here, to those of us who are the new custodians, the land is the source that inspires and nurtures us. As Big Sky expands and develops, it's fitting to look back at the first vision for resort development under the renowned news anchor and native Montanan Chet Huntley. In a tiny, unincorporated ranching community, Huntley envisioned a ski and summer recreation area, assembled a team of investors, and built Big Sky Resort. Our community transformed from ranch land to resort under Huntley's Big Sky of Montana Incorporated. Despite the passage of the Homestead Act in 1862, the Upper Gallatin Basin's West Fork drainage lay undeveloped decades later. The Gallatin Canyon presented a natural land barrier to potential homesteaders. Frank Crail joined a handful of homesteaders here in 1901 when he purchased 160 acres for $150 in what is now known as the Meadow. The Crail family annexed adjacent acreage to increase their holdings to 960 acres. The Crails operated their ranch, raising sheep, cattle, and hay for nearly half a century. Earlier development here was impeded because the meadowlands were dominated by the Crails Ranch, which prior to the Huntley purchase had been sold only twice, each time in its entirety in 1950 and 1962. While the Crails were ranching this area, a robust baby boy was born 80 miles away. His dreams and vision would shape the West Fork Basin dramatically. Chester Robert Huntley was born in 1911 to Pat and Blanche Huntley in a train depot in Cardwell, Montana. Pat was a telegrapher for the Northern Pacific Railroad, and the family lived on-site in employee accommodations. Seeking a healthier environment for his young family, Pat moved the family to Saco, Montana, along the High Line, to Homestead when Chet was just a baby. Chet's mother had been a school teacher who clearly valued education. The family had built this one-room schoolhouse on the ranch so that Chet could attend school. Chet enjoyed a ranching boyhood and a closeness with his parents and grandparents. But drought, hail, and grasshoppers drove the Huntleys off the homestead when Chet was 10 years old, leaving the maternal grandfather he worshipped. Chet describes in his autobiography, The Generous Years, that it was the end of a way of life, the end of an era. His father resumed a position as a telegrapher for the railroad, but the family often moved to towns along the line, following the insecurities of the seniority system. During his childhood, Chet lived in Cardwell, Saco, Willow Creek, Logan, Big Timber, Norris, Whitehall, and Three Forks. Chet learned to adapt, but perhaps more importantly, he learned the significance of the telegraph in reporting news along the railroad lines. Two forces of his early childhood shaped Chet's future: his reverence for the land and his experience with the conveyance of news. College studies in Washington lured Huntley away from Montana. After graduating from the University of Washington, his profession took him even farther. From the West Coast to the East Coast, from writer to newscaster, from radio announcer to television anchor.
Chet Huntley, NBC News, New York.
And David Brinkley, NBC News, Washington.
Although he relocated in New York for the NBC Huntley-Brinkley Report, in many ways, Chet never really left Montana. He took with him his father's oak roll-top desk, which had moved from train depot to train depot. That desk accompanied Chet across the country and returned with him to Montana when he retired. Sharon Huntley Kahn is Chet's older daughter.
An interesting thing about my father and David Brinkley was that they both really believed that a newsman should never be the news himself. They had great objectivity and integrity. And it sort of embarrassed them that their popularity was such that when they walked down the street, they were so recognized and they were so famous. That was not what they thought the news broadcast should be all about. It was about reporting the news. And during that period of time, there were incredible stories. There was Neil Armstrong's landing on the moon. There was Vietnam. that came into everybody's living room every single night. There was the tragic assassinations of our president, John Kennedy, his brother Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. These were really amazing stories of the time. And I think that night after night, 5 days a week, a half-hour broadcast became rather taxing. And there was something that was missing. My stepmother and my father bought a farm in New Jersey. They had 300 head of Black Angus cows. And I know that my father couldn't wait to get out of town, to get to that farm every weekend and sort of recuperate. Those were the years that made him kind of realize that he wanted something else in his life.
Chet returned to his beloved Montana to fly fish and to enjoy the outdoors as often as possible. Chet's parents and other family members retired to Reed Point along the Yellowstone River.
This is Reed Point, Montana, where my parents now live. Its population totals 65. I first saw this town in 1923 when it had a population of about 400. The town's boom period began in 1913. It prospered until the late 20s when highways and the Depression spelled disaster.
Reed Point became a place where the Huntley family gathered. Chet loved to fish the rivers in Montana and spent a lot of time on the Yellowstone. Chet's niece, Kristen Kern, daughter of his youngest sister, Peg, spent some of her summer vacations with her Uncle Chet at Reed Point and in the Gallatin Canyon.
So my brothers and I didn't go to camp in the summer. We got on a train with a Vista car, and we would come north to Montana and stay with my grandparents in the summer. And one of my fondest memories was when my grandparents had their 50th wedding anniversary in Reed Point, Montana, and it was a huge family reunion. And Uncle Chet took all of us kids fishing down on the Yellowstone. We also stayed in a Benepee cabin, which was in the Gallatin Canyon. So now living in Big Sky, I get the advantage of driving by that cabin every once in a while, and I get to relive all those great memories of learning how to fish with my Uncle Chet.
It was those vacations and the many acquaintances he made along the Yellowstone and Gallatin rivers that led Huntley to the Gallatin Canyon, just a stone's throw from his birthplace. Others from the Reed Point area had come before him. Ken McBride was the former owner of the Five Spot Bar in Absaroka, just south of Reed Point. In 1952, McBride bought the old Johnson homestead and began ranching the 5 Bar K in what is now the West Fork and South Fork developments. Sam Smeating, a rancher formerly from Muscle Shell, just north of the Stillwater area, had purchased the Crail Ranch and Lone Mountain Ranch in 1962. In his autobiography, Huntley confides that he was obsessed with mountains.
A Montana mountain range is forever so magnificently and perfectly based, all in proportion, its shoulders and snow crown in dimensional harmony with the massive and gently ascending foothills on which it is set.
In 1968, Chet found his mountain and his good life at majestic Lone Mountain in the Madison Range, with the Spanish Peaks to its north and ranchland to its east. Where others saw ranchland, Chet envisioned a resort. Jim and Patty Goodrich of the 320 Ranch, where Chet often stayed, introduced Chet to Smeating's land in 1968. First negotiations included only the Lone Mountain Ranch, which at that time consisted of the B Bar K and the Crail Ranch. It was Smeating who brokered the sale of the Corcoran timberland on Andesite Mountain. This would enable a resort that included both skiing and golfing. When Chet said his last goodnight to David Brinkley, he headed to Montana for clarity of air, clarity of thought, and uncluttered land.
This land contains an incredible quality and quantity of good common sense, and it's in no danger of being led down the primrose path by a journalist. At the risk of sounding presumptuous, I would say to all of you, be patient and have courage, for there will be better and happier news one day if we work at it. And David, thanks for these years of happy association and for being such an easy colleague to work with and for all the kindnesses.
Last night, NBC had a dinner for Chet and gave all of us a chance to say goodbye to him. And as a farewell gift, NBC gave him a horse. So, Chet, when you ride away to the west, to Montana, on your new horse, I will have to admit to at least a mild envy. And when you're out there under clear skies and clean air, maybe once in a while you will think of those of us still here. So, for the last time, good luck and good night, Chet.
Good luck, David, and good night for NBC News.
Huntley then connected with Chrysler Realty's Ed Homer. Homer became integral to the project, with Chrysler eventually owning over 50% of the share. Homer and Huntley quickly began to assemble a group of investors to bankroll the venture. They were joined by Northwest Orient Airlines, Burlington Northern, Conoco, and Montana Power, along with General Electric Pension Trust and Meridian Investment and Development. Chet owned a mere 1% of the projected $15 million resort, but it was Chet's vision, Chet's name, and Chet's integrity that ensured a successful venture. Ultimately, the project cost $30 million to complete. Homer chronicled and preserved this time period and project in a journal that captured the resort's heady and exciting planning and building. Big Sky of Montana Incorporated was born with Chet Huntley as the chair of the board. The combined Smeating and Corcoran land was nearly 8,800 acres. Later land swapping with the railroad brought over 10,000 contiguous acres forward for resort development, but with 70% of it kept in conservancy. Huntley's group set about transforming a landscape into a community that would eventually become an economic driver in the state of Montana.
The first time I saw Big Sky is when my father brought my sister and her family and myself and my family here to really see what in the world he was talking about and what was all this excitement about. That morning was one of those magical mornings in Montana where you have this clear blue sky, crisp mountain air. We all met at the Lone Mountain Ranch. And the Goodriches that owned the 320 Ranch had all the snowmobiles, and we got into these big puffy yellow suits, and we took off. And we went right up into the fabulous bowl of Lone Mountain. And then it was time for lunch, and Patty had these toasted cheese sandwiches all ready. We built a fire and roasted them, and that was amazing. Then we went back to the Lone Mountain Ranch, and there was this little guy, this little white-tailed deer that had been orphaned and lived at the ranch, and they named him Little Chet. And Little Chet was there to greet us. And I still like to think that that little guy was turned loose at one point, and maybe all his progeny is still roaming the mountains and the forests of Big Sky.
Huntley himself said, "For long years, I've had an ambition and a vision to somehow arrange it so that thousands of my fellow Americans, and visitors from foreign countries as well, might come to this state and see its resources and incredible scenery and meet its equally incredible people."
My uncle traveled a lot, and he saw what was happening in the Western Rocky Mountains with Aspen and Vail, and he thought, why can't something like that happen in my native Montana? So he envisioned a ski resort or a winter resort that would bring a clean development here and bring jobs and tourism, but still protect the beauty and integrity of the land.
The investors flew in experts to study the area. To ensure the terrain would support outstanding skiing, investors brought in Jean-Claude Keeley, who had recently triple gold medaled in the 1968 Olympics. Fred Pessel was the local expert who retired here in 1961. For nearly a decade, Fred explored the local mountain ranges and hiked Andesite and Lone Mountain to ski, foreshadowing the area as a resort. After meetings with Huntley and the various investors at the Lone Mountain Ranch and the 320 Ranch in 1970, Pessel heli-toured the mountain with Olympian Keeley. Together they skied what would come to be called Andesite Mountain's Ambush Trail. Keeley was eventually dropped into the bowl to take a run on Lone Mountain. Magnifique, Keeley proclaimed immediately. Fred Pessel wrote in his diary on February 12, 1970, "It will be quite some development." Just 2 days after the Keeley stamp of approval, Huntley and investors flew to Helena for a meeting with Montana Governor Forrest Anderson. The governor earlier had given permission to the group to use the state moniker of Big Sky for the resort. He also agreed to fund a state highway to access the resort. Together, the Huntley Group and the governor announced the coming of Big Sky Resort. In the early summer of 1970, Norwegian ski jumper Gus Rahm was hired away from a short 3-year stint at Jackson Hole in Wyoming. He was named president and CEO of the board. Rahm brought along with him his executive secretary, Lynn Poindexter. Many credit Lynn as essential to the project. Lynn described Chet as the kindest of men.
As a surprise, he hired carpenters to build ski storage into the small living accommodations that my 3 kids and I called home. He planned it and paid for it. I came home from work one day and it was done. Total surprise. Lynn Poindexter Bailey.
Kingsbury Pitch Pitcher, a ski resort developer from Colorado, mapped out the runs in 1971. Those slope names remain today. Huntley Hollow and Tippy's Tumble immortalized Chet and his wife. Killefer, named to honor Chrysler Corporation CFO Tom Killefer, changed later to Mr. K. The Lower Mountain Run of Mr. Ed would be added later to recognize Ed Homer's work on the resort. Hired to design the Meadow Golf Course was golf great Arnold Palmer.
My parents encouraged me to come up to Big Sky to see what was happening at my uncle's resort. So my girlfriend and I jumped in her VW Bug and we drove up to Montana. We stopped in the canyon at Karst for gas. Yes, there used to be a gas pump there and a little cafe. So we walked in an otherwise empty room. There happened to be one person sitting with a few friends, and it was Arnold Palmer. He was so friendly and engaging. He came over and introduced himself. He offered to buy us Coca-Colas, and we sat and chatted for a while. The next morning, he drives up on a golf cart with my uncle, and we're again formally introduced.
And the construction began. On the 7 acres acquired from Smeating on US 191, this unique building was erected to serve as Big Sky of Montana's first office and information center. John McCulley of Conocope joined the team. Tim Prather, Lone Mountain Ranch manager and wrangler, moved over to the alpine part of the resort as mountain manager. The Lone Mountain Ranch housed the resort design and operations team. Conocope built a travel shop at the entryway to Big Sky. Mike McCulley became the first manager of the Conoco station.
Chet was a regular guy. He shied away from unwanted publicity. Mike McCulley.
Instead of hay, it was silver bow condos that cropped up on the old Crail Ranch land, some of them designated for the resort's investors. And Big Sky's first commercial area sprouted where cows once grazed. The Mountain Mall and Gondola Station emerged from the mountainside, where gondola cars waited patiently for installation. The Huntley Lodge was built with a dining room, conference center, swimming pool, and some unique ranching decor.
I remember when the Huntley Lodge was being built and how proud our family was. And that pride was just compounded when the lodge opened and the walls were papered with large family photos, especially ones from Uncle Chet with his Herefords at the sale lot.
Not everyone shared Big Sky of Montana's vision. Montana State University conducted a thorough impact study funded by the National Science Foundation. One item captured by the study was local opinion. Locals' impressions of the coming resort were mixed. The National Forest Protection Group filed 2 lawsuits. One tried to block federal funds to support the planned Highway 64. The second suit intended to block a land exchange of Burlington Northern Holdings on the Big Sky site, held by the U.S. Forest Service. The NFPG feared the resort would ravage fragile land. Attorney David Pinwell had been enticed from Vail to join the Big Sky team. He advised the team and sometimes litigated the suits.
NFPG. It was a group of people who were opposed to a commercial development in the national forest, and there was a Forest Service exchange of federal property of national forest going to the private sector. And the opposition quickly surfaced, and so we knew we had to be ready for the initial and the subsequent lawsuits, which is where I came in.
Penwell explained the resort was designed to sustain itself through land development and real estate sales.
Obviously, a ski resort like that is a commercial enterprise, and it cannot survive or exist without being able to develop the property for commercial purposes. That is, sell lots for residential and commercial purposes.
The tiny unincorporated area straddled 2 counties and had inadequate density to incorporate as a town. So Huntley and Penwell incorporated the Big Sky Owners Association as a quasi-governmental agency. Gus Rahm became its first president.
The BSOA, Big Sky Owners Association, was there to function as a organization that was the community, the town. It was just bare land, a functioning dude ranch. And there had to be an organizing entity that put it together and then operated it after the resort went into business.
Construction of the resort continued at a rapid pace toward a 1974 opening, and the marketing started. Original resort advertising used the logo created in 1970 that is still used today. Big Sky was never designed to be an ordinary resort area. From the very beginning, it was planned as an all-season, self-supporting community where congeniality and family fun would be spontaneous, where beauty and natural surroundings inspired leisure and relaxation, and where culture as well as recreational activities can be pursued. Big Sky's captured the spirit of the West, the open, friendly, relaxed atmosphere of life worth living. Chet Huntley called the resort accessible seclusion.
We set out to create here the finest year-round resort on the North American continent. And without reservation of any kind, we can say that we have done precisely that. That judgment doesn't come from us. Rather, it comes from the hundreds of guests who are coming here to visit and to buy property. Big Sky is unique. It is big. It is beautiful.
I've seen my father fish the Yellowstone, the Gallatin, the Bitterroot. I've seen him dancing at the Plaza Hotel in New York City in a black tie with the governor's wife. I've seen him walk into Montana saloons, feel perfectly comfortable with the locals, telling stories after maybe a day of fishing. And I've seen him here at Big Sky, and nothing made him happier or have a sense of accomplishment and pride as Big Sky.
Homesteaders came to settle the Upper Gallatin and West Fork basins, 50 miles south of the nearest town through an unforgiving canyon. Ranching here was challenging for families. Dry land farming tested their hardiness, self-sufficiency, and spirit. But homesteaders enjoyed life and truly loved the land on which they chose to live. This land's natural resources and unique geological features have lured visitors and residents alike into our streams and onto our trails for more than a century. Chet Huntley's Big Sky is an open invitation to come and discover the striking beauty that he saw years ago, and to experience the exhilarating environment that satisfies and renews our spirit.
It's been fascinating to watch our guests arrive here. They drive up with the cares and the pressures and the anxieties still with them. But give them about 10 or 12 hours, and all the cares and anxieties and pressures have miraculously disappeared.
Chet once said, just as important as working for the good life is finding a place to enjoy it. Short, though, was Huntley's time here, from 1968 through 1974. His work on this land has given value to the lives of those who reside here, as well as those who come to experience and enjoy Big Sky.
Big Sky has a fundamental purpose, namely to demonstrate the technical skills which can permit man to live in harmony with nature at her very best. Big Sky is built not just for us of this generation, but as an endowment for generations yet to come.